Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to the series about anger, also known as Books My Dad Picked on a Theme that is anger, with, the title that there should probably be a better title, but I'm not gonna be coming up with a better title. So let us instead take a look at the cover art by Jim Burns for Harlan Ellison's Deathbird Stories. So let's start by reading Caveat Lector. You may have heard of Caveat Emptor, that is, buyer beware in effect. This is a reader beware. It is suggested that the reader not attempt to read this book at one sitting. The emotional content of these stories taken without break may be extremely upsetting. This note is intended most sincerely and not as hyperbole. Go at your own risk. Go at your own risk is written in a different font, all in caps and bold. And I think it is several point sizes larger than the other font, which is a sans serif of some sort. I get distracted by things. Anyways, what we have here is a collection of short stories that were published in magazines, that were published in other short story collections, and so it's stories that were clearly picked, sort of thematically consistently, but this wasn't something where he sat down and wrote a compilation of stories. This is just, approximately 10 years, give or take, worth of stories that Harlan Ellison, decided to throw together. Harlan Ellison is, of course, a capital N name in the area of science fiction, and for the record, we're going to use science fiction very loosely, because there's an interesting thing about the history of so-called science fiction, and that is, back in the days, ye olden days of pre-1960, but even back in the 1960s, you had just speculative fiction, which I believe was often just thrown under the label of science fiction. However, speculative fiction at that time, these days we have genres and subgenres. We have fantasy, we have urban fantasy, we have soft and hard science fiction, we have hard, fantasy and soft fantasy. We have magical realism. We have all kinds of things that we use to define fantasy, or speculative fiction rather. But a million years ago, when people were writing speculative fiction, they just kind of threw it all under the genre header of fiction about stuff that isn't real. You had murder mysteries, which were about somebody solving a murder, and then you had the genre fiction, which was stuff that involves technology or magic or junk that isn't real. It was a generalized definition that, as with many areas of genre fiction, led to people basically tarring it all with the same brush as trash. Sturgeon's Law derives from this, that somebody once asked the author Sturgeon, whose first name I cannot recall offhand, why do you write science fiction? 90% of it is crap, and his response was 90% of everything is crap. And at that time, you just sort of had everything jumbled together in the speculative fiction section of bookstores and libraries and whatnot. And so Harlan Ellison is known as a science fiction author. There is a certain validity to this. He has written episodes of Star Trek, at least one. Some of the best episodes of original Star Trek writing are credited to Harlan Ellison. At least one. I don't remember if he wrote more than one, because I'm not a big devotee of screenplay authors. He's a very, very big name. But the thing that puts him onto this list, as per my father, is that he was apparently an angry person. And you can see that in spades coming through in these stories. But he is, among other things, having credited at the time of people attempting to rehabilitate the reputation of President I am not a crook Dick Nixon, Tricky Dick, is that he is credited as having said the problem with this country is that nobody knows how to hold a grudge, speaking of the United States. I suspect he would not be any happier with the state of things now, but the thing about this book is that it is, as he says at various points, a book in a lot of ways about God. That he before each of these short stories, he'll put in a quote about God or gods or worship or what have you. You know, when the new god comes to the Big Apple, it's Kyrie Eleison. Turns out to be a prayer Kitty Genovese simply couldn't sing, but 38 others knew the tune. Posing the question, does the god of love use underarm deodorant, vaginal spray, and fluoride toothpaste? The thing about this is that in this book, the whimper of whipped dogs, the first story in this book, is about a woman who she sees a woman slowly and hideously knifed to death in the courtyard of her building, and she and everybody else in that apartment building just watch. Nobody calls the cops, nobody intervenes, nobody helps, and she is caught up in shock and horror, and what happens in this short story is you watch the slide of a young, optimistic woman who had moved to New York in an effort to sort of reach for her dreams and so on, as she basically, the city slowly corrupts her and tears her apart until she, in effect, reaches out to a deeper, darker, higher, probably Cthulhu-like, to be honest, given the way these stories go, power, when a man comes and breaks into her home and tries to rape her, and she looks out the window and sees everybody watching in the way that she and everyone else had with the murder several months before, and in that moment basically hands her soul over to a new god of the city. And it's a story about emotional, personal dissolution and decay brought on by being in dark places. And you have that story and the second story along the scenic route. Along the scenic route is very, very interesting because it basically seems to posit a universe where somebody said, you know what, people are going to have street races. Idiots and jerks are going to have street races. Let's legitimize it and put in a set of rules and make it so that people can just sort of do that. And then we read this story of a man who lets his testosterone-given need to prove that, a younger person with a better car driving faster than him somehow emasculates him, because we all know that that's how that works. If somebody in a better car than you drives faster than you, that means that you are less than a man. And it posits this world where you have this sort of strange, technologically complicated willingness to allow this and the horrific deaths that go on because of it. And there is, in these series of short stories, an undercurrent of anger, and it's an undercurrent of anger at the traditional anger at God for being unfair and awful, but also a traditional anger at people for deciding that they need to reach out to God to save them when they shouldn't, and an undertone of anger at the people who should be helping but refuse to, of people who could make things better but don't, anger at people who deliberately make things worse because they don't care, that you have this story that is absolutely baked in, social commentary about everything from people being shallow to people, throwing over their own morals or any number of other things just because it comes up. The titular story, Deathbird, is the last story in this collection, and it's based on an idea of there being two primary moving beings on the face of the earth, one of which is presenting itself as God, and the other of which is presented as the serpent. And it posits something that is hardly a, revolutionary thought, that what if God was bad and the serpent was good? But more than that, it presents God as shallow and childlike and just wanting to keep on playing with its toys, because that's what it wants to do, is it wants to play with its toys and is unwilling to let go, and by its desire to play with its toys, by its desire to push everything into dissolution and despair and awfulness, that it eventually effectively forces the other side, it forces the serpent into creating a vessel to effectively destroy the earth, just to put an end to everything. And it's an interesting perspective. All of these are interesting perspectives sometimes on God, sometimes on the devil, and sometimes on gods, and even there's that old saw about how gods require belief to continue to exist. There's a lot of fiction based around the idea of gods that as they lose followers, they lose power until they eventually cease to exist simply because no one believes in them. And he posits the counter to that as, sure, as the old gods die because nobody believes in Zeus anymore, what happens in response, though, is new gods arise, that as belief in the Judeo-Christian God fades, instead you get other new gods that rise up in their place, gods of mechanics, of electronics, of the strange dark places that brew in 20th century cities, that wouldn't have existed before the Industrial Revolution, before the Electrical Revolution. And so there's a lot that gets contemplated in this book, and I think there is an undercurrent of anger, but it's not undiluted anger. It is thought over, chewed over, carefully considered anger and contemplation, and it is very much a looking into some of the darker spaces of humanity, on what people are willing to sacrifice, and people's breaking points and turning points, and so on and so forth. It's not really my cup of tea, this, but if you're somebody who likes looking into that, yeah, it's very, very good. And I will say this, while the beginning is no doubt the bit that I read at the start about you shouldn't read them all at once seems hyperbolic. That's because it actually kind of is. This isn't quite as dark as, like, an entire book full of I have no mouth and I must scream, which was what I was expecting, and I didn't get that, which was kind of a relief, because I don't need an entire book of that. I don't think anyone does. So yeah, that's everything, and I will see you all next week.